Welcome to the Codependency Surviving Cluster B Relationships Podcast. Want and need to understand codependency? Want to heal from both codependency and from a BPD or NPD relationship of any type? This podcast is for you. Counselor and codependency recovery coach AJ Mahari has 33 years experience helping people heal from codependency family of origin woundedness and recover from cluster B relationships. Sessions can be purchased and booked at ajmahari.ca. And now, here's your host, AJ Mahari.
In this episode, I'm going to be cutting through the noise, the confusion, and the growing trend of denial around something very real and very painful, and that's codependency. There's some people out there, even professionals, right? There's no, codependency doesn't exist. In this episode, I'm going to debunk 7 of the top reasons people and or professionals out there that don't know what they're talking about are going to say codependency is just a myth. I'm going to debunk those myths because some professionals claiming that codependency isn't real, or that it's just a pop psychology fad, or worse, an insult to caring people. But here's the truth. Codependency is very real. It's not just a set of behaviors. It's a deeply rooted relational survival strategy. Patterns formed in childhood and reinforced by dysfunctional relationships. So in this episode, I'm going to walk you through 7 of the most common myths that claim codependency doesn't exist and debunk each one with clarity and facts. So the first myth, that codependency isn't real, people say, well, codependency isn't real because it's not in the DSM. Well, to debunk that, this argument is one of the most common and one of the weakest. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual of American Psychiatry is a political and medical document, well, ever-growing like text and whatnot, but it's not a definitive catalog of every legitimate human struggle or mental health struggle that people go through. Many deeply real conditions like complex PTSD, high-functioning autism were debated, delayed, or excluded from the DSM for years. And in fact, I don't think anything about autism really should be in a, quote, psychiatric manual, given that autism is not a psychiatric problem. But complex PTSD is still not included in the DSM, and yet nobody would say, well, complex PTSD isn't really, because it's not in the DSM. But people say that often about codependency. The DSM is not in any way a complete compendium of anything, really. A psychiatrist in the 1980s even proposed diagnostic criteria for codependent personality disorder, highlighting its clinical relevance, and that was in the 1980s, to DSM-3. And the DSM did not accept that as a, codependent personality disorder or a clinical relevance to codependent personality or codependence at the time, because they just are lazy and they do whatever they want and it doesn't always make sense. And they said codependency overlaps too much with borderline personality disorder and dependent personality disorder from cluster C. And for some people, this can be very true, but for a lot of other people, codependency isn't necessarily so overlapping with either of those 2 personality disorders. So really, they probably should have been given its own category, whether called a personality disorder or not. Just because something isn't officially classified yet doesn't mean it doesn't wreak havoc in people's lives and cause a lot of pain and suffering. Because codependency certainly does do that in a lot of people's lives. We do not need a diagnosis to validate lived patterns, lived experience that are dysfunctional, cause suffering and pain, and lead people into unconsciously and keep people stuck in trauma bonds with people with borderline personality or narcissistic personality disorder, because as if that isn't very real, it certainly is. Myth number 2, quote, codependency is just pop psychology, end quote. Well, to debunk that, codependency may have entered public conversation through recovery circles and popular books that no longer apply, like, decades ago, with a different sort of definition, but that doesn't mean it lacks substance. The foundations of codependency come from family systems theory, attachment trauma, and clinical observations in addiction recovery. And now we know more about it, because it's not just about if somebody's an alcoholic or somebody has a substance addiction, but people are actually having these patterned addictions on a person who might have BPD, for example, because of childhood and patterns with a caregiver, a parent, or something that has to do with your family system, attachment trauma, and or some other kind of woundedness in childhood. The term of codependency and what it really means gained traction because therapists and recovery groups saw recurring patterns: compulsive caretaking, boundary collapse, loss of self in relationships, and emotional fusion with others' needs. Pop psychology can distort, but it didn't invent this. Codependency isn't fluff. It's a pattern rooted in survival, not trends. Myth number 3. Quote, everyone's a little codependent, unquote. Well, to debunk that, this myth is like saying everyone gets sad sometimes, so depression isn't real. Yes, people need people. We all want love, connection, and sometimes we overextend ourselves. But codependency is not an occasional overgiving. It's chronic self-abandonment, compulsive rescuing, inability to say no, identity fusion, and emotional over-responsibility. It's caretaking. It's trying to fix somebody. It's trying to rescue somebody. And at its base, often unconsciously, for people with codependency, it's a lot about trying to control things so you can try to establish some sense of emotional safety in a relationship that maybe what you experienced in childhood didn't really teach you how to do that. It becomes your default way of relating. You don't just care. You can't not care, even when it's destroying you. Codependency is not a trait. It's a trauma-driven identity and relational strategy that's learned somewhere in childhood. Myth number 4. Quote, codependency is just empathy being pathologized, unquote. Well, to debunk that myth, codependency isn't about shaming sensitive people. It's about compulsive empathy without boundaries. Empathy that consumes you. True empathy includes the ability to feel for others while staying connected to your own self-worth needs and limits. Codependency, on the other hand, often means you don't know where you end and the other person begins. You're not just caring, you're merging with the other person, absorbing, trying to fix, and often losing your sense of self in the process. Because it's not just about empathy, it's unhealthy, toxic, way too much empathy that you're giving to somebody with BPD or NPD, for example, and you're not really being empathic to yourself at all. Empathy can be healthy, but codependency is empathy unmoored from self-respect, so it's not healthy. Myth 5, quote, codependency is just a trauma response, so it shouldn't be its own thing, unquote. Well, to debunk that, yes, codependency for most people is, to one degree or another, a trauma response, but that doesn't make it any less real. In fact, that makes it more important to recognize and heal. It often stems from childhood emotional neglect, enmeshment, or growing up in homes where your needs were ignored and your value was tied to caretaking or people-pleasing, where maybe you were parentified and then you felt made to feel responsible for mom or dad's feelings, and that's where you started becoming codependent. There's many other examples, but your value, you learned in childhood that your value was tied to people-pleasing. But codependency becomes more than a response. It becomes a relational identity. It's so patterned. It's so ingrained in people. How you show up, attach, and survive in relationships is going to be very much a pattern distinguished as codependency because of this relational identity and how you're repeating patterns from childhood in the first place. Naming codependency gives you power to stop reenacting your past. See, it's not just borderlines and narcissists that reenact their past. It's people with codependency too. It's not all the same, but you know what I mean. Myth 6. Quote, it's just a way to shame women for caring, unquote. Well, to debunk that, this myth has some truth in that early writing on codependency did disproportionately focus on women, but that was because women were more socially conditioned to be self-sacrificing, not because women are the only ones who experience it. And I think actually to say, oh, quote, it's just a way to shame women for caring, unquote, kind of also ignores the fact that a lot of men care a lot about a lot of people, care about a person in their life, care about a significant other. So, in a way, it was also a slap at men as if they didn't care about anybody that they might have been relating to or in a relationship with. Codependency affects, well, both genders or all genders, and naming it isn't about shaming anyone. It's about liberating you from inherited or learned patterns in childhood that keep you over-functioning in a dysfunctional way, undervalued, and emotionally invisible, not seen or heard. Caring is not the problem. Losing yourself in caring for another and not caring for yourself is the problem. Codependency is not a gender issue. It's a survival adaptation begging to be unlearned. And myth number 7, quote, if you can't measure it, it's not real, unquote. Well, to debunk that, this claim misunderstands psychology itself. Most emotional suffering can't be scanned for or blood tested. Does that mean anxiety and grief or depression and heartbreak aren't real? No, it doesn't, I would say. Codependency manifests in your nervous system, your relationships, your choices, and your stress levels. It's observable in patterns that repeat again and again and again and across all kinds of different people, men and women. You feel the effects in your exhaustion, resentment, anxiety, and inability to say no. That's real, whether or not a lab can chart it. Just because something is invisible doesn't mean it's imaginary. Closing thoughts. If you've ever been dismissed for using the word codependent, if you've ever been told it's fake, exaggerated, or meaningless, I want you to know your experience is valid. And even for those people denying codependency and trying to call it all kinds of other things like, oh, I'm an up-leveled codependent, so now I'm an empath, and all this kind of nonsense, well, people go a long way sometimes to avoid the truth, and that's only going to increase your pain. And, you know, one of the issues in codependency is denial. But really, you need to face the codependency because it is really real. And codependency may not live in a diagnostic manual, but it lives in your body, it lives in your mind, it lives in your thoughts, your feelings, it dictates your actions, it lives in your relationships, and it's a big part of your heartbreak. And naming it is the first step to reclaiming yourself and getting on the pathway to healing. I hope that was helpful, and the more people want to claim the codependency doesn't exist, I think, and especially some of the professionals that say this, I don't know why they're doing that, because you have to remember, just because someone's a professional doesn't mean they know everything. And it's interesting the agendas that some professionals have in the information that they share. You know, I hope you find this information helpful, and I hope that if you're denying codependency or you think somehow that's like pathologizing you too much, you really need to think about it. You really need to understand it more. And not every single thing or pattern about codependency is going to apply to every single person with codependency. And I'll just add in, and we do have cultural codependency, living in narcissistic times, which doesn't mean everybody's a narcissist. So codependency is in many ways very discernible, the patterns of, and it's very, very real. I hope that was helpful. And as always, take care.
You've been listening to the Codependency Surviving Cluster B Relationships podcast with your host, AJ Mahari. AJ hopes her information is helpful And if you resonate with and want to work with AJ, please go to ajmahari.ca to purchase and book a session or sessions. Thanks for listening, and catch you next time.